Good evening, comrades and friends. The talk that I'm going to give tonight is based on an article that was posted today on the website liberationnews.org. As Evelyn mentioned at the beginning, there's also an article that was posted today, an important article on Egypt, on what's going on in Egypt right now, written by two of our Egyptian comrades who are about to travel there. You know, there's a familiar mantra that we've heard for many, many years, people who have paid attention to the Middle East, and that is the statements that come from the mouths of the leaders of Israel, that Israel wants peace, but it cannot find a partner for peace. This is repeated over and over and over again. In fact, the opposite is true. Israel is a highly militarized and expansionist settler state that thrives on war and has thrived on war. And in the book, Palestine, Israel, and the U.S. Empire, I describe some of this historically, that in 1949, that is 1 year after the formation of the State of Israel, when it had confiscated through war 78% of what had been the British colony or mandate of Palestine, Moshe Dayan, who was then a young military officer and who was later to be the defense minister at the time and later prime minister and defense minister, or really should be called minister of war in the 1967 war, told a U.S. diplomat at a cocktail party in Jerusalem that the borders of Israel were ridiculously small, meaning that they had to expand. And where they were looking at expanding was particularly the takeover of the West Bank. That was in 1949. And since that time, the same kind of game has been played with the media, and that is that, and particularly with the U.S. media, and that is that while Israel is an expansionist state and has been an expansionist state since its beginning, desiring to take more and more territory, it must pose as the victim. And I'll talk a little bit more about that later. In other words, and to appear to be the victim of aggression rather than the aggressor that it actually has been. The events of the past few months have reaffirmed this basic truth about the State of Israel, which the corporate media deliberately conceals from the people of the United States. And deceiving the people here, the public here, is particularly important because Israel is so highly dependent, not only on the billions of dollars in annual aid and the incredible military gifts that have been given them, military goods that aren't given to any other country, but also because of the, and maybe even more important, the invaluable political protection that the United States extends to Israel, without which, without that aid, without that protection, Israel would be a completely isolated country in the world and probably would not exist as a country in the world. And in return for this protection, unlike the argument that is advanced by some here in the anti-war movement and some who aren't in the anti-war movement and are really on the right wing, it's not because Israel controls the United States or because the pro-Israeli lobby is really occupying Congress or something like that. It's because Israel has repaid for this protection, this aid, by protecting and defending U.S. imperial interest in the Middle East. And as a hostile colonial implantation, it is in a state of perpetual conflict with the surrounding Arab countries and has played the role, very important to imperialism and its designs on the Middle East, of severely distorting development in the entire region. And of course, one of its neighbors, through which it remains at a state of war with, was discussed in the first half of the meeting by Comrade Mazda, which is Syria. Syria has not been able to have normal development through its entire history, nor has Jordan, nor has Egypt, or any kind of normal, because every step they took, particularly when there were more progressive governments in place, more leftist nationalist governments in place, that they have always had to think at every moment, since they became independent states around the same time as the State of Israel came into being, what will Israel do if we take this step? Or what will the United States have Israel do if we take this step? And this was certainly true. Mazda mentioned a time in the late 60s when the government, Saleh Jadid, was in power, was the most left-wing government. And then there was the 67 war. And then in 1970, there was what was the Jordanian tremendous repression of the Palestinian movement. The Palestinians were 2/3 of the population. They were rising up against the king, Hussein, who was a CIA-paid agent. And the U.S. gave him the weapons against the Palestinians, and Syria came in to support the Palestinian resistance. And the Israelis threatened that if they didn't get out and stop their support for the Palestinians, that Israel would intervene in the war. And as a result of that, the Palestinian resistance was crushed with 15,000 people killed. And the government of Saleh Jadid fell very soon afterwards, as Mazda had mentioned. That's just one incident among really hundreds and hundreds and hundreds of decisions that are made, of developments that have happened or not happened in the Middle East under the shadow of this immensely built-up military power. Israel is a country of 7 million people and is rated as the 4th or 5th most powerful military in the entire world. I mean, talk about a monstrous creation. I mean, that's amazing. In just the 1 month since the U.S. election on November 6th, Israel has carried out, and just since November 6th, a week-long deadly bombing of Gaza, announced that thousands of new settlement units would be built on stolen Palestinian land in the West Bank, and revealed plans for a massive settlement project that would cut the West Bank in two, completely sever the northern and southern parts of the West Bank. And following an overwhelming 138-9 vote by the UN General Assembly admitting Palestine as a non-member observer state, Israel halted the turnover to the Palestinian Authority of $100 million in taxes collected from West Bank Palestinians, which they are required under the negotiations that happened previously to turn over, as well as announcing the new settlement plans. And by the way, we should say something about the 138-9 vote. You know, when the U.S. leaders are trying to mobilize against a particular targeted country, whether it's Libya or it's Iran or it's Syria, you know, they invoke the idea of the international community. Well, they didn't talk much about the international community after this vote. That was not a good subject for them to be discussing. I mean, international community, when it's spoken by these operatives in Washington, Obama or Clinton or Susan Rice, you know, it means those who side with us, those who we've either bribed or threatened or coerced in some way their governments to be on the side we want them to be. That's the international community at any given time. And while both the U.S. and Israeli governments claim that they support a, quote, two-state solution, that is the state of Israel and next to it a Palestinian state, they bitterly opposed Palestine gaining even the status of a non-member state. And their arguments were nonsensical. I mean, if you were listening to them, Susan Rice, the U.S. ambassador to the UN and who Obama wants to appoint as Secretary of State, said it would place further obstacles in the path to peace. What does that mean? What obstacles does that place? You say you want a two-state solution. They get recognized, not even as really a state, but you know, an observer, an observing state. But that would be an obstacle to peace. And Israel's deputy foreign minister, Danny Alon, in an interview given while the bombs were still falling on Gaza on November 20th, painted Israel as the patient peace seeker, frustrated by alleged Palestinian intransigence. And he said, quote, "We are still waiting at the negotiating table. It was unfortunate that almost 4 years went by, almost wasted because the Palestinian Authority, under the leadership of Abu Mazen, that means Palestinian Authority President Mahmoud Abbas, refused direct negotiations." Yeah, the poor Israeli negotiators waiting there at the table. I mean, I don't think they were actually waiting at the table. But reality is very different from this propaganda. The two-state solution proposed by the United States is for a Palestinian state in Gaza and broken up chunks of the West Bank. This is what the U.S. is proposing. That's the real proposal. With, and this is very important, Israel retaining control of the borders, the airspace, the water, the mineral rights, and no right of return for the Palestinian refugees, among other conditions. That's the U.S. proposal. But even that kind of, which would mean that this would be a disarmed, I should say too, a disarmed state next to the fourth or fifth most powerful military in the world. So really, that's a recipe for a colonial relationship, and would be a colonial relationship with Israel as the dominant power. But even this kind of colonial arrangement is unacceptable to the Israeli leaders. When the Palestinian Authority negotiators agreed to all of these conditions in 2008, and this was revealed in January of 2011, just at the time of the Egyptian revolution was breaking out, what was called the Palestine Papers were revealed. It was kind of like a small WikiLeaks kind of thing with, but didn't come from WikiLeaks, but with thousands of documents that were released. And what the documents turned out to be were very embarrassing for the Palestinian Authority negotiators. Very embarrassing, because they agreed to all of those conditions in the negotiations. They said, okay, that's it, we agree. We'll have a little place on the outskirts of Jerusalem, you know, we'll call that Jerusalem, and that'll be our capital. But they accepted every one of these. And at the time, the Israeli foreign minister, Tzipi Livni, responded, "We do not like this suggestion," this is a quote, "because it does not meet our demands. Probably it was not easy for you to think about, but I really appreciate it." I mean, talk about the condescending colonial attitude. And what Livni meant by our demands is Israel's so-called right, an unlimited right from their point of view, to keep seizing land in the West Bank. Since the Oslo peace process began, as it's called, in 1993, this has been the Israelis' consistent approach to negotiations, regardless of whether a Labor or a Kadima or a Likud party government was in office. The negotiators talk peace when they're meeting, while the state of Israel creates new facts on the ground in the West Bank in the form of hundreds of settlements. Former PLO advisor Michael Tarazi summarized it a few years ago. He said, "We are negotiating about sharing a pizza, and in the meantime, Israel is eating it." Today, there are more than 500,000 Israeli settlers living, all of them living on confiscated Palestinian land in the West Bank, existing in their own little apartheid world with their own roads that only they can ride on, with settlements based on militarized settlements on the top of hills, unlimited use of the water resources, which are scarce in the region, completely and protected by the Israeli military, what they call the Israeli Defense Forces, which we call the Israeli Occupation Forces. And I would say so much for the myth of Israel not being able to find a partner for peace. Between November 14th and 21st, in the latest assault on Gaza, at least 162 Palestinians were killed and more than 1,400 wounded, and much of Gaza's infrastructure and public facilities, homes, etc., destroyed by a massive, coordinated air, sea, and land-based bombardment. On the Israeli side, there were 6 killed and 240 wounded. The main attention was, and what you heard in the media, what we heard in the media here over and over again, whether it was from US officials or Israeli officials, was no country can be expected to live in a circumstance where missiles are raining down on their population. Well, the missiles raining down on the Israeli population were nothing compared to the missiles and the bombs and the shells raining down on the Gaza population. On November 19th, Secretary of State Hillary Clinton, who was in Southeast Asia, she took an unplanned trip to the Middle East, to Palestine, Israel, with the aim of brokering a truce. And Clinton's emergency trip was a clear sign of the Obama administration's fears that the continuation of the brutal Israeli assault on Gaza was endangering U.S. imperialist interests in the region. And Obama himself played a key role in the negotiations. I think he stayed up all night one night, the night before. The recording was, 2:30 in the morning, he was calling this person, and 3:30 in the morning, he was calling this person. So they were desperate to get this ended, even at the same time as making all these pronouncements, such one-sided, incredible pronouncements. And from the beginning, they expressed all-out support for the Israeli side, while pointedly ignoring the Palestinian casualties altogether. A moment of supreme absurdity, even for the U.S. political system, even for the Congress of the United States, occurred on November 16th. On that day, the House of Representatives passed a resolution expressing unwavering commitment to Israel. That's not surprising. The surprising part was this, that House Resolution 813 was introduced at 12:04 p.m. on November 16th and declared adopted without objection at 12:05 p.m. That's 1 minute later. There was, needless to say, not a lot of discussion or debate over the resolution, nor would there have been. Despite its obscenely pro-Israeli rhetoric, the Obama administration was clearly fearful that a new Israeli ground invasion of Gaza might provoke further rebellions in Egypt, Jordan, and other neighboring countries, and possibly lead to a wider war, which they wanted to avoid. From the beginning, where they stand at the beginning, they felt that the situation changed very rapidly, that the political situation. This is reminiscent, I think, of what happened in 2006 when there was the Israeli war, the Israeli-Lebanon war, where at the beginning of the war, then the Bush administration, Secretary of State Condoleezza Rice, when she was questioned about all the civilian casualties and all the destruction of civilian facilities in Lebanon that was obviously going on, apartment buildings and everything else, said, it's the birth pangs of the new Middle East. And this kind of a, But 3 weeks later, she was at the Security Council, and they stayed there on a Friday night until late into the night, much later than those bodies usually work, to get a ceasefire agreement because they felt that, like what has just happened now, was turning into a danger for their interests in the region. Playing a key role in brokering the agreement was Egyptian President Mohamed Morsi. Morsi followed within a few hours, and the U.S. was very happy about this. Clinton went to meet with him, but within a few hours after that agreement, and this was no accident, he took the opportunity to immediately declare a number of measures that, if enacted, would make him the virtual dictator of Egypt. No one could overrule him. No court could overrule him. And since then, there have been massive protests that have engulfed the country of opposition. The timing of his declaration was not accidental. It came just after he had played this key role, working closely with Secretary of State Clinton, and on terms which ended up bringing a ceasefire without ending the blockade of Gaza, which is really what the U.S. wanted to see. That's the outcome they wanted. And I think Washington's gratitude for this was reflected in the very, very muted criticism of Morsi's attempted seizure of almost absolute power. Despite the fact that the death and destruction inflicted by Israel and the fact that they have no Air Force, Navy, armored units, or anti-aircraft defenses whatsoever, which means it's not exactly a great courageous act for people in fighter bombers to fly in and drop bombs, even though they're celebrated back home in Israel. The same way, that the U.S. pilots were celebrated in, Iraq, Obama was just talking about how brave they were the other day or a few months ago again. I mean, there was never one plane shot down in all the years of the no-fly zone in Iraq. There were hundreds and hundreds of bombings that took place. But despite that, the lack of all those resources, the Palestinian resistance was not defeated. There were huge celebrations in Gaza, celebrating the resistance after the ceasefire. The terms of the temporary truce reportedly called for a halt to the fighting, an end to Israeli targeted assassinations of Palestinian leaders, and undefined steps to lift the Israeli blockade that has inflicted massive suffering on 1.7 million Palestinians in Gaza. Lifting the blockade is a critical issue for the people in Gaza. Whether there will be any real movement in that direction remains in doubt, as does the durability of the truce as a whole. While Israel withdrew its settlers and bases from Gaza in 2005 because they couldn't conquer the area, really, it's kept the area surrounded and blockaded ever since. As a result, half of all school children in Gaza are malnourished. 2/3 of infants are anemic. They get about 20% of the trucked-in food supplies that were coming in. And the United Nations Relief and Works Agency, UNRWA, has to support the population in Gaza because the population is mainly made up of refugees and descendants of refugees who are also under international law refugees in a very, very small area. And that was a result of an outcome of the UN partition vote and the war that followed it way back in 1948. But very small percentage of the trucks, the food trucks and other supplies come in. Virtually no building supplies come in except those that are smuggled in. And it's a very desperate situation for people. In the 1960s, the Black Panther Party had a saying about racist cops who justified their killing and brutalizing of black people by saying that they were masquerading as the victim of an unprovoked attack, that the police, and the same thing goes on today, the police are always threatened, aren't they? And then, well, there was no gun, it was a cell phone, oh, but we still had to, fire 41 bullets or something like that. But I would say that description of masquerading as the victim of an unprovoked attack perfectly fits Israeli Prime Minister Benjamin Netanyahu and his predecessors. In the US mainstream media, Israel, as I said, is invariably depicted as the victim. Its brutal and cowardly military assaults are always termed retaliation. Just watch, just listen to the reports. They are always retaliating. Even when they start it, and they clearly started it, they're retaliating for something. Something happened sometime, and that word suggests that they're acting in self-defense. And it's very interesting that what we've just seen happen in Gaza is so similar to what happened. It didn't go as far. What happened immediately after the election, the US election of 2008. In November of 2008, on the day after the US presidential election, the Israeli military shot down 5 civilians in Gaza. That broke what was called a hudna, the Arab word for kind of ceasefire, that had existed for 6 months. And it started the train of events that led to the all-out military assault on Gaza that lasted from December 27th to January 18th of 2009. A vast array of weaponry, some of it experimental, was used on people in Gaza. Among the weaponry used were white phosphorus and a great amount of depleted uranium munitions. More than 1,400 Palestinians were killed. The Israeli forces had 13 killed, as a ratio of more than 100 to 1. 4 years later, just last month, the fatal shooting of a mentally disabled young man on November 5th near the border and a 12-year-old boy on November 9th, both killed by the Israeli army units inside Gaza, set off the new round of fighting. And then on November 14th, Israel assassinated in his car a top Hamas leader named Ahmed al-Jabari. it was on the afternoon of a day when in the morning he had been presented with a proposal for a long-term ceasefire by a joint Israeli-Egyptian group. And there was an op-ed piece by a man named Gershon Baskin, who was the Israeli negotiator, an op-ed piece in the New York Times about this a couple of weeks ago. If you want to read it, you can go to the New York Times site and Google his name, Gershon Baskin. And so that act exploded the situation. And then followed by, rocket attacks from the Palestinian side, and then this massive bombing campaign. Hundreds of aircraft, ships, tanks, artillery, firing into a small, densely populated part of the world. So what I'm suggesting, of course, or stating, is that Israel wanted this. They wanted the new conflict, but in order to look good for the U.S. public mainly, they want to make it appear that it's the Palestinians who have caused it. Why would they want a conflict right now? One, there's an upcoming election in Israel, and war has usually been good for the party that's in power there, or in office. That party is the Likud party, but it has just recently merged with an even more fascistic group headed by a man named Avigdor Lieberman, the present foreign minister, called in English, Israel Our Home, and they've merged into one party. And the other one, and I think I failed to mention this, that what the blockade has done to Gaza, just to go back for a second, in 2006, the Hamas party was elected, won the election, the Palestinian election. And in the aftermath of that election, blockade was imposed on Gaza. Economic blockade, and the U.S. agreed, the European Union agreed, and there's this incident that was reported the next month in the Israeli media, in the Haaretz newspaper, and it was about a meeting that had taken place with top officials, top security officials, and a man named Dov Weissglass, who was the top advisor to then Prime Minister Ehud Olmert, told the people there, it'll be like a trip to a dietitian. The Palestinians will get a lot thinner, but they won't starve. And according to the Haaretz account of this, then the assembled people, including Tzipi Livni, who was the foreign minister, rolled with laughter. So now I bring that up because now they have another kind of joke that's going on, and that is that these occasional assaults on Gaza are akin to mowing the lawn. And that is to weaken the Palestinians, to weaken the Palestinians in Gaza in particular, through these kind of brutal assaults that take place. It's like another one of the dietitian jokes. Whether the present ceasefire holds and for how long can't really be known. I don't think there's any appetite on the part of either the U.S. or the Israeli government right now to go back in and to start this again. But, we don't know how the events will unfold. The real solution to this is not just lifting the blockade of Gaza. The real solution, the only real solution to the crisis, when you think about the history of this over the last 65 years, where the Palestinians have been counted out time after time after time, they haven't gone away. They're not going away. And the only real solution is that there be real self-determination for the Palestinians, including the right of return for those who forced out of their homeland. Thank you.